Sir, the cemetery is closed. You need to leave immediately.
Please, officer. I buried my wife this morning. I just need a few more minutes to say goodbye.
Police tased a grieving veteran. 7 minutes later, the Marines arrived. When 72-year-old Marine veteran Frank Monroe refused to leave his wife's graveside after visiting hours, Officer Bradley thought he was dealing with a stubborn old man. But when Frank was tased and collapsed on Evelyn's grave, the Marines who arrived 7 minutes later would make sure justice was served. Arlington National Cemetery stretched endlessly under the gray November sky, its pristine white headstones standing in perfect formation like eternal sentries guarding America's fallen heroes. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the rows of graves while the distant sound of taps echoed across the hallowed grounds from another military funeral. Ancient oak trees, their branches now bare, stood as silent witnesses to decades of grief and remembrance. The air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter and the solemn weight of sacrifice that permeated every inch of this sacred ground where honor and memory converged. Frank Monroe knelt beside his wife's freshly covered grave, his weathered hands trembling as he placed a single red rose on the dark earth. At 72, the retired Marine gunnery sergeant's once powerful frame had been diminished by age and the devastating grief of losing Evelyn, his wife of 48 years, to cancer just 3 days earlier. His dress blue uniform, carefully pressed for the funeral that morning, now bore wrinkles from hours of kneeling on the cold ground. Frank's steel-gray eyes, which had once commanded respect in Marine barracks around the world, were now red-rimmed with tears he couldn't stop shedding. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star ribbons on his chest told the story of a man who had served his country with distinction in Vietnam, but today he felt more vulnerable than he had in any firefight. Evelyn had been his anchor for nearly 5 decades, the woman who had waited for him through 3 deployments, who had raised their children while he served overseas, and who had nursed him through his own battles with PTSD and the physical wounds that had earned him his medals. Without her, Frank felt lost in a world that suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. The cemetery's official visiting hours had ended at 5 p.m., and it was now approaching 7:30 as darkness began to settle over the grounds. Frank knew he should leave, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away from Evelyn's grave. This was their first night apart in 48 years, and the thought of going home to their empty house, to the silence where her laughter used to be, was unbearable. When the security patrol car's headlights swept across the cemetery, Frank didn't move. He had nowhere else he wanted to be, and leaving felt like abandoning Evelyn all over again. Officer Derek Bradley had been patrolling Arlington for only 6 months, and his approach to rule enforcement was rigid and uncompromising. At 28, he viewed regulations as absolute with no room for exceptions or special circumstances. When he spotted the figure kneeling by a grave well after closing time, his first instinct was to remove the trespasser as quickly and efficiently as possible. "Sir, the cemetery is closed," Officer Bradley announced as he approached Frank, his flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness. "You need to leave immediately." Frank looked up slowly, his face etched with a pain so profound that it should have given any reasonable person pause. "Please, officer, I just buried my wife this morning. I just need a few more minutes to say goodbye." Bradley's response was cold and procedural. "Sir, visiting hours ended over 2 hours ago. Cemetery regulations are in place for security reasons. You need to gather your belongings and exit the premises now." Frank's hands clenched into fists, not from anger at the officer, but from the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume him. "She's been gone 3 days, and I haven't figured out how to live without her yet. Please, just give me a moment." Officer Bradley had been trained to maintain authority in all situations, and he interpreted Frank's emotional plea as defiance of his lawful orders. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Stand up and move toward the exit, or I'll be forced to place you under arrest for trespassing." Frank remained kneeling, his hand resting on the temporary grave marker that bore Evelyn's name. "Officer, I'm a 72-year-old man grieving his wife. I'm not a threat to anyone. I just need to tell her that I love her one more time." The standoff continued as Bradley radioed for backup, describing the situation as a non-compliant trespasser refusing lawful orders. What he failed to communicate was the context, that he was dealing with an elderly veteran at his wife's fresh grave, a man whose world had just been shattered by loss. "Sir, this is your final warning," Bradley said, his hand moving to his taser. "Stand up and leave voluntarily, or I will use force to remove you." Frank closed his eyes and whispered to Evelyn's grave, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I tried to stay with you as long as I could." What happened next would haunt Officer Bradley for the rest of his career and spark a national conversation about compassion versus protocol. When Frank didn't immediately comply with his order to stand, Bradley deployed his taser, sending 50,000 volts through the grieving veteran's body. Frank collapsed onto his wife's grave, his body convulsing from the electrical shock, while his dress uniform became soiled with the fresh earth that covered Evelyn's casket. The sight of a decorated Marine veteran writhing in pain on his wife's grave was an image that would soon be seared into the national consciousness. "Suspect is down and secured." Bradley radioed, apparently unaware of the magnitude of what he had just done, requesting transport for arrest processing. But Frank wasn't just any suspect. Unknown to Officer Bradley, Frank Monroe had been more than just a Marine. He had been a mentor and father figure to dozens of young Marines over his 30-year career. Many of those Marines were now serving in positions of authority throughout the military and law enforcement communities. One of them, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, had been visiting his own father's grave just 3 sections away when he heard the commotion and recognized Frank's voice crying out in pain. Staff Sergeant Williams had served under Frank during his first deployment to Afghanistan, where the older Marine had saved his life during an ambush outside Kandahar. Frank had not only pulled Williams from a burning Humvee, but had also helped him through the PTSD that followed becoming the father figure that Williams had never had growing up. When Williams saw Frank convulsing on Evelyn's grave, something primal and protective surged through him. "What the hell did you do?" Williams shouted at Officer Bradley, rushing to Frank's side to check his vital signs. "Sir, step back from the suspect," Bradley ordered, his hand moving to his weapon. "This is a police matter." Williams looked up from Frank's prone form, his eyes blazing with fury. "This suspect is Gunnery Sergeant Frank Monroe, United States Marine Corps, retired. He's a decorated combat veteran, and you just tased him while he was grieving his wife at her grave." The confrontation escalated as Williams refused to back down, positioning himself protectively over Frank while calling for medical assistance. "This man saved my life in Afghanistan. He's earned the right to mourn his wife without being brutalized by some rookie cop who doesn't understand what service and sacrifice mean. Williams immediately activated the informal network that connected Marines across the country, sending out urgent messages through social media and military communication channels. The message was simple but powerful. Gunny Frank Monroe needs us. Arlington National Cemetery, now. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marines stationed at Quantico, the Pentagon, and bases throughout the Washington, D.C. area began converging on Arlington. Off-duty Marines, retired veterans, and active duty personnel who could get away from their duties all received the same call to action. Within minutes, the first additional Marines arrived on scene. Sergeant Major Patricia Rodriguez, who had served with Frank in Iraq, was among the first to respond. Behind her came a steady stream of Marines in various uniforms, some in dress blues, others in utilities, and many in civilian clothes, but wearing their military bearing like armor. "What's the situation?" Rodriguez demanded as she assessed the scene. Frank was now conscious but disoriented, still lying on Evelyn's grave, while Williams provided first aid. Officer Bradley stood nearby, clearly overwhelmed by the growing crowd of military personnel who were looking at him with barely contained hostility. "This officer tased Gunny while he was mourning his wife," Williams reported. "No provocation, no threat, just an old man who needed a few more minutes to say goodbye." The arrival of Colonel James Harrison, Frank's former commanding officer, who now worked at the Pentagon, marked a turning point in the confrontation. Harrison's presence brought both military authority and political connections that Officer Bradley couldn't ignore. Officer Bradley, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of military command, "I need you to explain to me why you felt it necessary to use a taser on a 72-year-old combat veteran who was mourning his wife." Bradley, now facing a crowd of nearly 30 Marines and growing media attention as word of the incident spread, attempted to justify his actions. "Sir, he was trespassing after hours and refused to comply with lawful orders to leave the premises." "Did you consider the circumstances?" Harrison pressed. "Did you take into account that this man had just buried his wife of 48 years? Did you attempt any form of de-escalation before resorting to violence?" The questions hung in the air as more Marines continued to arrive, forming a protective circle around Frank, who was slowly regaining his strength with the help of a Navy corpsman who had responded to Williams' call for medical assistance. As news crews began arriving at Arlington, drawn by reports of a veteran being tased at his wife's grave, the situation evolved from a local incident into a national story. The optics were devastating for the Arlington Police Department. A decorated Marine veteran still in his dress uniform being brutalized while grieving at his wife's fresh grave. Frank, now sitting up with the support of his fellow Marines, looked around at the faces surrounding him with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "You didn't need to come," he said weakly to Colonel Harrison. "I don't want to be any trouble." "Gunny," Harrison replied, using Frank's old rank with obvious affection, "you taught half these Marines what it means to take care of each other. Did you really think we'd let you face this alone?" The challenge now wasn't just about Frank's treatment by Officer Bradley. It was about ensuring that the incident led to meaningful changes in how law enforcement dealt with grieving families and veterans. The Marines who had rallied to Frank's defense were determined to turn this moment of injustice into a catalyst for reform. The situation reached a critical point when Arlington Police Chief Robert Martinez arrived on scene to find his officer surrounded by dozens of Marines' national media crews and a growing crowd of civilians who had heard about the incident through social media. The image of a veteran being tased at his wife's grave had gone viral, and the police department was facing a public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Chief Martinez, a former Army sergeant himself, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Officer Bradley, step away from the scene," he ordered. "I'll handle this from here." But the damage was already done. Video footage of Frank being tased, recorded by a visitor who had been leaving the cemetery, was being broadcast on every major news network. The sight of a decorated Marine veteran collapsing onto his wife's grave while in full dress uniform created an image that would define the national conversation about police accountability and compassion. Chief Martinez, Colonel Harrison said, approaching with the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with high-level crises, "We need to discuss how this situation is going to be resolved. This isn't just about one officer's poor judgment. This is about institutional failures that allowed this to happen." The chief nodded grimly, understanding that his department's reputation and his own career were now hanging in the balance. The Marines surrounding Frank weren't just angry. They were organized, connected, and determined to ensure that justice was served. The pivotal moment came when Frank himself, still weak from the taser shock, but supported by his fellow Marines, asked to address the growing crowd. His voice was shaky but determined as he spoke to the media and the assembled Marines. "I want everyone to understand something," Frank said, his words carrying across the cemetery with the authority of a man who had commanded respect for decades. "I'm not angry at Officer Bradley. He's young. He was following what he thought were the rules, and he probably never had to deal with a situation like this before." The crowd fell silent, surprised by Frank's grace in the face of such treatment. "But what happened here tonight can't happen to other families," Frank continued. "When someone is grieving, when they're at the lowest point of their lives, they need compassion, not confrontation. They need understanding, not enforcement." Frank's words resonated not just with the Marines surrounding him, but with the millions of people who would watch his statement on news broadcasts around the world. Here was a man who had been brutalized while mourning his wife, yet he was using the moment to advocate for others rather than seeking revenge. "Evelyn would want something good to come from this," Frank said, his voice breaking as he mentioned his wife's name. "She always believed that even the worst situations could be turned into opportunities to help others." Chief Martinez stepped forward, recognizing that Frank's grace was offering him a path toward redemption rather than destruction. "Mr. Monroe, I want to personally apologize for what happened here tonight. This is not how the Arlington Police Department trains its officers to handle situations involving grieving families. The resolution began when Chief Martinez made an unprecedented decision that would reshape his department's approach to community policing. Effective immediately," he announced to the assembled crowd and media, "the Arlington Police Department will implement new protocols for dealing with grieving families and veterans in crisis situations." The announcement was more than just damage control. It represented a fundamental shift in how law enforcement would approach situations involving emotional distress and mental health crises. Frank's ordeal was becoming a catalyst for change that would benefit countless other families facing similar situations. Officer Bradley, who had been standing apart from the crowd, approached Frank with obvious remorse. "Sir, I want to apologize. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for what I put you through on what should have been a private moment with your wife." Frank looked at the young officer with eyes that held no anger, only sadness. "Son, I hope you'll learn from this. I hope you'll remember that behind every rule and regulation, there are real people dealing with real pain." The exchange between the veteran and the officer who had tased him became a powerful symbol of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest moments. As the immediate crisis subsided and the media attention began to focus on the broader implications of Frank's treatment, the Marines who had rallied to his defense organized a proper honor guard for Evelyn's grave. What had started as an emergency response to protect one of their own had evolved into a ceremony that would give Frank the dignified farewell he had been seeking. Colonel Harrison coordinated with Arlington's administration to ensure that Frank would be allowed to complete his vigil without further interference. "This man has earned the right to grieve his wife in peace," Harrison told the cemetery director. "We're going to make sure he gets that opportunity." The Marines formed a respectful perimeter around Evelyn's grave, creating a sacred space where Frank could finally say the goodbye he had been trying to express when Officer Bradley interrupted him. The sight of dozens of Marines standing at attention around a single grave created a powerful image of brotherhood and respect that transcended rank and generation. Frank, now steady on his feet, but still emotionally fragile, approached his wife's grave with the support of Staff Sergeant Williams and Sergeant Major Rodriguez, the two Marines who had been first to respond to his crisis. Despite the overwhelming support surrounding him, Frank struggled with feelings of guilt and embarrassment about the attention his grief had attracted. "I never wanted any of this," he confided to Colonel Harrison as they prepared for the final ceremony. "Evelyn always said I was too proud, too stubborn. Maybe if I had just left when the officer asked." Harrison placed a firm hand on Frank's shoulder. "Gunny, you did nothing wrong. A man has the right to mourn his wife, and you handled yourself with more dignity than most people could manage under the circumstances." The doubt in Frank's eyes reflected not just his grief, but the vulnerability that comes with being thrust into the public spotlight during the most private moment of loss. The Marines surrounding him understood that their role was not just to protect him from further harassment, but to help him find the strength to complete his farewell to Evelyn. The final ceremony began as the sun set completely over Arlington, with the Marines' honor guard standing at attention while Frank approached Evelyn's grave for what he knew would be his last private moment with her. The pressure of the day's events, the media attention, and the weight of his grief all converged as he knelt once again on the earth that covered his wife's casket. "I'm sorry I caused such a fuss, sweetheart," Frank whispered to the grave. "You know how I get when I'm hurting. I just couldn't leave you here alone on your first night." The Marines maintained their respectful distance, but their presence provided Frank with the security and dignity that had been stripped away by Officer Bradley's actions. The honor guard represented more than just protection. It was a tangible reminder of the brotherhood that had sustained Frank throughout his military career and now supported him in his darkest hour. The emotional weight of the day made it difficult for Frank to find the words he needed to say to Evelyn. The trauma of being tased, the public attention, and the overwhelming grief all combined to leave him struggling to express feelings that had been building for days. "I don't know how to do this without you," Frank said, his voice breaking as he spoke to the grave. 48 years, and I never learned how to be alone. You were always there, always knew what to say, always knew how to make everything better." The Marines standing guard could hear Frank's words, and many of them found themselves thinking of their own loved ones, their own fears about loss and separation. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been the first to respond to Frank's crisis, felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to the man who had saved his life pour out his heart to his deceased wife. The climactic moment came when Frank pulled out a letter he had written to Evelyn during the 3 days between her death and the funeral, a letter he had been carrying in his uniform pocket, waiting for the right moment to share it with her. "I wrote this for you," Frank said, his hand shaking as he unfolded the pages. "I wanted to tell you everything I never got to say while you were fighting the cancer." As Frank read the letter aloud, his words carried across the cemetery with the power of absolute love and devastating loss. He spoke of their first meeting at a USO dance in 1975, of their wedding day, when he was on leave between deployments, of the children they had raised and the grandchildren who would never know their grandmother's laugh. "You made me a better man than I ever thought I could be," Frank read from the letter. "You waited for me through 3 wars. You held our family together when I was deployed, and you loved me, even when the nightmares made me difficult to live with." The Marines, listening to Frank's words, understood that they were witnessing something sacred, not just a man's farewell to his wife, but a testament to the kind of love that sustained military families through decades of separation and sacrifice. The ceremony concluded when Frank carefully folded the letter and placed it on Evelyn's grave, weighted down with the red rose he had brought that morning. As he stood to leave, the Marines' honor guard came to attention and rendered a final salute, not just to Frank, but to Evelyn's memory and to the sacrifice that military spouses make in service to their country. "Thank you," Frank said to the assembled Marines, his voice stronger now than it had been all day. "Thank you for helping me say goodbye properly. Thank you for making sure she knew she was honored." As the honor guard began to disperse, Frank took one last look at his wife's grave, now decorated with the letter that contained 48 years of love and gratitude. The ordeal that had begun with a taser shock had ended with dignity, respect, and the knowledge that Evelyn's memory would be protected by the brotherhood that had sustained Frank throughout his life. Immediate results: 150 words, the video of Frank's treatment, and the subsequent response by the Marines sparked a national conversation about police protocols when dealing with grieving families and veterans in crisis. Officer Bradley was suspended pending investigation, while Chief Martinez implemented immediate changes to training procedures that emphasized de-escalation and compassion in emotionally charged situations. The Frank Monroe Protocol was adopted by police departments across the country, requiring officers to receive special training on handling situations involving grief, mental health crises, and veteran-specific issues. The protocol emphasized the importance of understanding context and showing basic human compassion before resorting to enforcement actions. Frank became an unintentional advocate for police reform and veteran rights, using his newfound platform to push for changes that would prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma during their most vulnerable moments. His grace and forgiveness in the face of injustice became a model for how to turn personal tragedy into positive change. The Marines who had rallied to Frank's defense established a support network for veterans dealing with loss and grief, ensuring that no veteran would have to face such challenges alone. Long-term impact. 150 words. 5 years later, the Frank Monroe Protocol had been implemented in over 500 police departments nationwide, leading to a measurable decrease in confrontational incidents involving grieving families and veterans. The training program developed in response to Frank's treatment became a model for law enforcement agencies around the world. Frank continued to visit Evelyn's grave regularly, but now he was often accompanied by other veterans who had lost spouses, creating an informal support group that met at Arlington to share memories and provide mutual comfort. The Marines who had responded to his crisis maintained their connection with him, creating an extended family that helped fill the void left by Evelyn's death. Officer Bradley, after completing extensive retraining and community service, became one of the most effective advocates for the new protocols, using his mistake as a teaching tool to help other officers understand the importance of compassion in law enforcement. The incident had transformed from a moment of injustice into a catalyst for lasting change that would benefit countless families facing similar situations. Final personal moment, 100 words. On the 5th anniversary of Evelyn's death, Frank returned to her grave carrying a new letter and accompanied by Staff Sergeant Williams, now a close friend who visited regularly. As he knelt to place the letter on her headstone, Frank reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night when he had been tased while trying to say goodbye. "You'd be proud of what came from all this, sweetheart," Frank whispered to the grave. "You always said that good could come from the worst situations if we were brave enough to look for it." As the sun set over Arlington, Frank stood with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had turned his darkest moment into a force for positive change, ensuring that other grieving families would be treated with the dignity and compassion that everyone deserves in their time of loss. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting back against injustice, but from transforming that injustice into a force for compassion and change.